Welcome to Dental Business RX. Practice success in 30 minutes or less.
Thank you for calling ABC Dental.
As you might imagine, I truly enjoy listener feedback and questions. Regularly hearing from you is not only inspirational and validating, it also serves as a real-time feed of ideas to keep the show relevant and to stay on top of the subjects that you'd most like to hear about. Now, I attempt to answer each question individually when I'm asked. And many of these questions from you and fellow listeners have been the inspiration for quite a few of our episodes. And with that said, there are a number of questions I've received which were really good, but the answer wouldn't fill a 25, 30-minute episode. It's something that I could address in maybe 5 or 10 minutes. I couldn't build an episode around it. So I thought for this week's episode, why not take 4 of these questions and do a listener Q&A episode. And specifically, I'm going to focus on financial questions I've been asked. And so with that, let's go. My name is Jeff Bloomberg, and I'm your host. And I'm going to start with my normal disclaimer, sort of like when you're watching a drug commercial. I am not an accountant. I am not a tax attorney. So obviously, I'm going to be discussing finances. If there are issues, the tax issues, legal issues, things of that nature, I do rely on you to check with the appropriate person on your team, your CPA, your tax attorney, etc. And, we're big believers in that everybody's responsible for their own conditions, so you have to follow your own guidance with relation to these things. All right, so let's start with the first question. What insurances should I have for my practice? So look, the thing with insurance is there are insurances you absolutely have to have, like malpractice or work comp or general liability for your building and your office. And then there are insurances which, you may or may not have. So what are the most common ones that I see a client come in with? They'll, of course, have malpractice where they can't work, some form of general liability, in case somebody slips and falls in the reception area or something like this, workers' compensation here in the United States. They may or may not have health coverage for themselves and their employees. And most people will have some form of a life insurance policy that's attached to the practice somehow because they had to get it in order to get their practice loan. What are the less common insurances that we see? Disability. There's, long-term and short-term disability. Something called EPLI insurance, employment practices liability insurance. Overhead insurance. And business interruption insurance, and some people have cybersecurity. So let me pick these up. Obviously, I'm going to start with the life insurance thing. I've been asked, should I have life insurance? I mean, most of the people listening to this probably do. Obviously, if you have a spouse and children, that's a no-brainer. You should absolutely have life insurance. And what I see in a lot of cases is people will have life, and unless they have a massive practice loan, the life insurance policy isn't very big. But they're underinsured from a life perspective, at least in my opinion. Again, I'm also not a licensed insurance agent. But with life insurance, you have to think, what would it take to not just keep your family from starving in the first year? You'd have to think, what's it going to take if you're gone? And it's a morbid thought. When I bought my first life policy with my wife, I bought my first one, and then we bought, and I just did it, but then we went and bought a really large one, the two of us together, and she didn't want to talk about it. It's just like when you're doing estate planning. You're having to go over very morbid subjects. You're thinking about what happens if I'm dead, which nobody really likes to think about for good reason. But it's something that should be confronted, and I would just confront it from a very analytical, sort of no-attitude perspective. I wouldn't get upset about it or whatever. You're basically doing this to cover yourself in the event that something unexpected happens. So if you have a spouse, kids, anybody who's relying upon you, then a life insurance policy is an absolute necessity. And I would look at how much that policy should actually be. Right? I'm not going to get into the debate whether it should be term life or whole life. That's something you can discuss with the insurance agent. The only thing I would say there, whole life obviously is far more expensive because there's a lot more potential with that. It gets invested and it could eventually pay for the premium itself, and you could get a sort of an annuity with it or something like this, or a pension or whatever you want to call it. Whereas term life is a term, right? It's 15 years, 20 years, 30 years or whatever, and then it's over. But I'm not going to get into the ins and outs of that. The only thing I would say is I have seen some people sold the wrong policy. So make sure you really understand what you're buying when you're buying it. If I see somebody who's 65 or 70 and they're buying a term life, or a whole life policy, to me that doesn't make a lot of sense, because then for it to be worth anything, it's going to cost them 4 or 5 times what the term life policy is going to cost them. and it's not going to pay back anything for 20-something years. So when they're 87 years old, they might see some money from it. I mean, to me, that doesn't make a lot of sense. The idea, obviously, as you get older, is that you will be self-insured. You've accumulated enough assets that you don't have to have a life insurance policy. But if you don't have one because you didn't have to get one for your practice loan or whatever, or you find that you're underinsured, it's definitely something that I would look at and confront. I've talked to many young couples over the years, and I've found that they don't have it. They need to get it. And it isn't always for the high earner. Like you might have a couple and one of the spouses is a high earner and the other isn't. I wouldn't just get insurance for the high earner. I'd get it for both, probably for an equal amount, because you got to imagine, again, this is why people don't want to look at this. It's morbid. But even if you have somebody who has a stay-at-home mom or dad and then you have a doctor, you lose the doctor's income, so you insure the life of the doctor, but what happens if something happens to the stay-at-home mom or dad? Well, I mean, okay, fine, the doctor can still earn money, but they're not going to really want to work very much for a while, are they? Their spouse just passed away. So I'm a big fan of insuring both. Again, look, these are all my opinions, but this is just something that you should look at and think about. Okay, so now let's get into these less common insurances for a second. Disability. This is, again, something that you have to decide on your own. There's short term, like if you're knocked out of commission for a few months, you break your wrists in a skiing accident or something, or snowboarding accident. Then there's long term in case you're no longer able to practice. This is where it'll pay a monthly amount for a certain period of time or indefinitely. There you just have to weigh if this is something that you want. Right? Again, this isn't something where I'm going to categorically say everybody has to buy this. Some people do, some people don't, right? And in certain cases, it's just going to, with regular disability, it's just going to cover your income. It's not going to necessarily cover the practice. That's what overhead disability is for. You get it in case you need to be able to continue paying your overhead. That's just, for me, this is where it's a personal decision based on risks and what you're comfortable with and, finances. If it's something that you feel is a good idea and it's something that fits within your plan and your overhead, then you might want to do it. Now, next insurance that's less common, employment practices liability insurance. This you would have never heard of 10 years ago, okay? Now you see a lot of people with it. So basically, what is this? This basically covers you in the event you end up with some type of a lawsuit from an employee. You fired somebody and they said that you fired them because they were pregnant, let's say. Let's say it wasn't the case. Hopefully it wasn't the case because you shouldn't do that. But let's say you did. They're claiming you did. All right, so if you have no insurance for this, you're going to have to hire a lawyer. They're going to have to represent you. In most cases, these things don't go to trial. There's going to be some form of a settlement, and it may cost you, depending on the circumstances of the case, a little bit or a lot of money. The whole idea with employment practices liability, I'm just going to call it EPLI, folks, if you're okay with that, is it covers you for this. So you get a claim from an ex-employee or a current employee. They represent you, just like in the case with malpractice. If you had a malpractice case, the insurance company gets an attorney and they represent you and they're taking care of it for you in exchange for you paying your premiums. Your premiums may go up afterwards. But beside that point, with EPLI, it works the same way. The only little caveat I would give you if you're going to get EPLI, if you're getting to the point where you're getting quite a few employees, it's maybe not such a bad idea to have. Obviously, I would look at cost. And also you want to look at coverage. It's just like any other coverage in that you can have 150,000, 250, $1 million, etc. You might want to discuss it with your attorney as far as like how much would these cases normally cost, so you can get a good gauge on how much you should insure yourself for. I have seen people who get in trouble with this and they're underinsured. But if you're getting a decent amount of employees, it may be a good idea to look into this. As I said, the only little caveat I want to add is I would try to have it where your EPLI policy allows you to have some input on picking an attorney. In other words, most EPLI policies assign you an attorney from them. It's either somebody on the insurance company's payroll or somebody they have a deal with, right, that they're paying a certain amount. Well, what if the attorney that you want isn't part of that insurance company or isn't connected in any way? Well, they're not going to pay anything towards that, and you might need a specialized attorney for your particular situation. So, EPLI policies that, when I recommend somebody gets one, it's usually make sure there's a clause in there where the funds that would normally be used to pay the EPLI insurance company's attorney could be used to pay the attorney of your choice. It's the only thing I would say there. All right, and then we have these last two less obscure ones, or more obscure ones rather, which is business interruption. This is, you have an earthquake, you can't use your practice for 6 months, or a pipe breaks and the practice is closed for 2 months, etc. This is, again, some landlords require it. I'm sort of ambivalent on that one. There you just have to assess your risks and see if it's something that would be worthwhile to you. We have a policy for business interruption here at MGE, and I was hoping we could use it during COVID because there was a period where, our business is based on mass gatherings and people traveling, which obviously during COVID wasn't a really popular thing to do. So I was hoping that would help. It didn't help. And we just recently had a couple hurricanes, so we're filing a claim there because we had to shut down for 2 weeks. I had to shut 2 seminars down because of Hurricanes Helene and Milton. So I don't know. I'll let you guys know if it does anything for us. I don't know. But this is where you have to assess this for yourself. The only thing I would say is really take a look at, be very clear on when you can file a claim and when it will pay. All right. And then cybersecurity. I've seen a few clients walk in with this. This is if somebody hacks your system or whatever. You may or may not need this. This is something you discuss with your insurance agent because most softwares have a cloud-based component to them now. So really you can't get hacked. It would have to be, Dentrix getting hacked, in which case really the liability falls on them. This is a question for your insurance agent. And another issue I've seen come up recently, and I'm going to throw this one out to you to decide whether it's something that you would be interested in or not. And it's something I don't know a ton about. So I'll give you that disclaimer. Essentially, when you have, let's say you have a practice with several doctors in it, might be you and your spouse and a couple associates or something like this. Well, every doctor is going to have malpractice, right? Because that's, a basic condition of working. But I've seen it where some offices will have an overall practice malpractice policy on top of the individual doctor malpractice. And it has come into play in certain cases where they end up with a lawsuit from a patient where they're not only suing the associate, let's say, but they're trying to sue the owner doctor as well as the practice. That can be helpful. That's something I would discuss with your insurance agent, but it's just something to be aware of. It's something that I'm seeing more of these days. Anyway, so that's the insurance issue as far as insurances. I hope I have not put you to sleep. I will give you a few things to consider there, but really it comes down to there are certain things you have to operate, and then essentially insurance is just a transfer of risk, right? I buy car insurance. Well, number one, I have to, but I buy it because they're taking on the risk. If I run my car into a pole, they're paying for that. They're taking on the risk for that in exchange for my premium. So you have to look at what your risk tolerance and appetite is and if it's a good idea for you as far as the investment into that. All right, so let's go on to the next question. We'll get away from this insurance thing. This is a good one. How much business reserves should I have? All right, in other words, how much ready cash should you have in your business at any given time? So I'm going to give you 3 things with this. Number one, the common answer if you search on the internet for this is 3 to 6 months of expenses, all right? But most people figure this wrong. If I have to basically support my business, and by that I mean at least make sure the bills are paid and the staff are paid, etc. So if I have to support my business due to some form of a closure, like a good example would have been the shutdowns during COVID. Well, my overhead, while I'm essentially closed or can't operate, is not going to be the same as if we're producing, crazily and I've got full staff in the practice. It's not going to be the same overhead. Because you look in a dental practice, normally the largest expense is employee salaries. That's usually it should be no more than 22.5% of your overhead, but in a lot of cases it's more. It's 25, 30%. So if we're at a point where we can't work, I'm probably not going to be paying full salaries to everybody because we're not seeing any patients. I don't have anything for anybody to do. Okay, they might be partially employed. I may have to lay some people off, etc. So when we say 3 to 6 months of overhead, we're not talking about, let's say your practice is doing well and it's doing $200,000 a month and your overhead is, $150, okay? Well, that's with everybody there. The practice is going great guns, the overhead's $150. Well, what is it without that happening? What are the basic expenses? Rent, electricity, etc. It's not going to be $150 a month. It might be closer to $75 to keep everybody taken care of, and you might have partially employed employees, or you might go down to a couple different employees if essentially you've had to shut down for the most part. Well, so then when you're calculating that 3 to 6 months, you do it off of that basis. What would happen if I had to work through a closure or had to at least keep the bills paid for the practice and keep myself from going bankrupt? Well, I'd need $70,000 a month or $60,000 a month. Okay, well then I want 3 to 6 months of that. So I need $180,000 to $360,000 in reserves, right? That would be that'd be the first thing I'd be thinking about when I'm looking at this reserves number. The next thing is, reserves isn't only for business closures. All right. And there's a whole financial system we teach. Actually, we teach it in our finance seminar, which actually is coming up here soon at MGE. And I just put a course onto DDS Success, our online platform. I'll put a link to it on the episode webpage where I go through this. There's actually 4 parts to this course. I think we released up to part 2 and part 3's in editing right now, or maybe part 3's up. I don't know. I kind of do know. I think it is up, but maybe not. Anyway, so maybe I don't. Where we go over, how to allocate reserves, etc. So reserves can be used for many other things, other than just shutdowns, things like big pieces of equipment, etc. But to keep yourself comfortable, this is where also risk appetite comes in. You have to look at, what is it going to take for you to sleep at night? If you're thinking, if I don't have at least 3 months of reserves in my practice bank account, I don't sleep at night, then have at least 3 months of reserves. You might want to have 6. You might sleep better. In some cases, people just don't care, in which case, don't worry about it. I like having at least 3 months, possibly 4 months in the business so that I can kind of weather any type of storms economically or otherwise in case, I have to adjust what I'm doing in order to make things go. And the last point on this reserves is you want to make sure if you have business reserves, you're obviously, there's here in the U.S., you have things like FDIC coverage, Federal Depository Insurance Corporation coverage, which allows for a coverage up to $250,000 per person per bank, right? So obviously, if your business reserves are $500,000, you probably wouldn't want to keep it all in one institution, or you might want to make sure you can keep it in a way where it's somewhat insured. In some cases, so the point being is you want to make sure whatever reserves you're keeping, and again, like I said, check with your accountant, your lawyer, etc. You want to make sure that reserves is pretty quickly accessible. I wouldn't put my business reserves into some type of an investment that takes me a long time to exit. I want to be able to get my hands on that money in the next couple of days if I need it. So, things like money market funds and things like this are good. You at least earn a couple points of interest. I leave that to you to make sure that you put it in the right place or whatever, but I wouldn't have it invested in a bunch of stuff, especially not something that's volatile like options or stocks or something like this. I would not have my business reserves in there because then that could be worth X amount one day and then the market crashes and it's worth 50% of that the next. So those are just my little pieces of advice. Again, check with your accounting and tax team to verify that for yourself. All right, so that's that question. Let's go to the next one. When would I use my profit and loss statement versus my overhead sheet? What's the difference? This is a pretty interesting question, just because I have addressed this before on the podcast. Profit and loss is basically, if you take a look at a profit and loss, because some people look at it, sometimes it's called an income statement. And this is where we get in trouble, folks, because there's things that are adjacent to your business, but that has something to do with your business that you may or may not know. So we look at these things, we don't know them. And then because we don't know them, we just don't want to deal with them. And as a business owner, that will get you into trouble. You should know what these things are. It doesn't mean you have to be able to be a tax expert, but you should at least be able to understand them. So you've got your profit and loss or income statement. Look, if you get one for your practice, look at what it has. It has your income at the top. Then it might have something like cost of goods sold or cost of services. These are things, they're essentially expenses. They're just classified differently that are essential to the delivery in your business. Some people count like credit card fees in there or finance company fees in there. And then you have general expenses, salaries, lab, supplies, et cetera. And then at the end, it shows you the profit. So all a P&L is a record of what you made and what you spent for a given period of time. If you might have an accountant that gives you one once per month. You might use QuickBooks or some other similar software where you look at it once per month or quarterly. But it is a record of what you made versus what you spent. But it's essentially a record. In other words, it's something that is after the fact. So if I'm looking at my P&L for September and it is October, I'm looking at what I made and what I spent. There's nothing I can do about that for the month of September. That's over. Okay? An overhead sheet is a little different in that you're taking a look at all of your expenses and you're looking at what you should be spending for each of those categories. You're planning ahead. I am allocating this much for dental supplies. I'm allocating this much for lab. I'm allocating this much for employee salaries, et cetera. So you have a generalized idea of what it costs to run your business. So where these two things come, where they work together and where they come in handy, well, let's take a look at this for a second. So if I have an overhead sheet and I know what my overhead is every month, which I can then break down further to know what my overhead is every week, which is helpful because then I'm working off shorter time periods. I can make sure that we're exceeding my overhead every month so that we're profitable. At the end of that month, I can look at my profit and loss statement and see how we did. I can compare it up against my overhead sheet. I can see, hey, did we spend too much here? Did we spend too little here? Is there something, did I misestimate for this one particular category? Did I not put enough? Did I not allocate enough? Like I'm only allocating, I thought I was spending $5,000 on marketing, but we spent 10. Let's go back to spending 5. Whatever things you're thinking about, you can adjust those using that P&L because that's a record of what you actually spent. Where it gets dangerous to think that your P&L is sort of the end-all be-all on what you're looking at is the time period within which you're looking at it. So I'll give you an example of this. Let's say you have a tax bill that's due once a year in your municipality or your state, and you happen to pay that tax bill in the month of, November. So when you look at your P&L, it's going to show that your profit is much less than it normally is because you paid your tax bill, okay? But that isn't the case every month. You might even look at it and go, gosh, the profit is normally $20,000. It's only $4,000 this month. That's messed up. Well, it's not an accurate way to look at it. If you were looking at it quarterly, that might even itself out, or even annually. But, I wouldn't rely on it as much as you might think. I would look at it. I would compare it to my overhead sheet. You use it for loans. You use it to determine financial health. Obviously, if I'm pulling it for a year and it shows I'm not profitable, or even for a month, it's something that I'd want to dive into. They work together. But the first thing I'm going to have is my overhead sheet because then I know what does it actually cost to run my business, and then I'm using my P&L to compare it against. If you want a good overhead sheet, we have one. I've offered it on the podcast before as a download. I'll put it on the episode webpage. It is an extremely thorough 25-category overhead sheet. It really hits on all the points in a dental practice. It's very well adjusted. If you wanted, it's a spreadsheet, free download on the episode webpage. All right, so then we get to our last question. And with this question, the more I'm thinking about it as we're going through, this one could have been an episode. So let's take a look. It's a two-part question. What should I do with my profit? And should I be using my profit to pay off debt faster? Okay, sort of a two-part question there. So this is a really big one. So first off, let's look at what profit is because there's some, not really confusion on it, but there's a degree of confusion on this when it comes to doctor compensation, okay? Because different doctors compensate themselves different ways. And again, questions about this, if you want to change something or do something, whatever, this is why you talk to your accountant, okay, folks? So let's say the practice I have does about $150,000 a month. I'm the doctor. I pay myself $20,000 a month salary. Okay, so I get a paycheck every 2 weeks for $10,000 less taxes. All right. My overhead, though, is only about $120,000. That includes my salary. Okay, so we collect $150,000. Overhead's about $120,000. I'm already paying myself my $20,000, which supports me okay at home, and we end up with a $30,000 profit every month. So at the end of the month, I have a $30,000 profit. That's money after my expenses are paid. This is what is left over because that's essentially what profit is. All right. So in some cases, because I've seen this in some practices, the doctor pays themselves instead of $20,000, they pay themselves, $6,000, which isn't enough to pay their home bills, and they're relying on their ability to draw on some of that profit to cover some of their home bills. Okay, that's where the confusion starts to seep in, how the doctor is compensating themselves. So, look, whether it's classified as a paycheck or salary or profit or whatever, and again, that's an accountant question, let's look at a couple of basic things or ideas here. First one is, if I'm doing an overhead for my practice and I'm trying to figure out what does it cost to run my business, part of that overhead is the compensation that I need in order to live comfortably at home. Okay, that's part of the overhead. Because if I don't figure it into the overhead, that's a problem. And it's actually going to camouflage some problems in my business, which I'll explain. So let's say my overhead, I do my overhead sheet, and it comes to $100,000. But that only has like $6,000 for me as the owner doctor, which isn't enough to live on. So, and then I want to make a bonus plan for my staff. All right, because my staff are asking for a bonus plan. So we do $102,000. I'm still not making it. That doesn't work for me. Okay, and then let's say I decide to use that overhead as a basis for my bonus plan. I've seen people do this. So I go, okay, anything over 100, I'm going to pay a certain amount in bonus. So do 110. The staff are happy with the bonus. I'm still broke. Okay, the point being is whatever you have to make, whether it's being taken as a distribution of profit or salary, I don't care. This is something you work out with your accountant, should be baked into your overhead sheet. Because if you're paying bonuses, you want your staff to win, but that means you have to win as well. Everybody has to win here. Otherwise, it just does not work, okay? So that's the first thing. Now, let's take that example I started with, and if you're driving, I apologize because I got numbers flying all over the place. Practice collecting $150, doctors paying themselves $20,000 a month. Overhead, including the doctor's pay, is $120. That leaves a $30,000 profit every single month. Let's say it's consistent, because if the profit's only there 1 month and then it's not there for the rest of the year, it's, what's kind of the point, right? But let's say it consistently ranges anywhere between $20,000 and $40,000 a month in profitability. Well, now you have some extra money, which is really good. So what I would recommend, if you want to figure out, what do I do with this? Should I be paying off debt? Should I be doing this? Should I be doing that? Is the first thing you have to have for yourself is a plan. I remember years and years and years ago, this was like 2006. I guess that wasn't that long ago, right? 18 years. But wasn't like in, the Paleolithic age. But in 2006, I was sitting down with a client. He just bought an office. He spent a lot of money on it. In 2006, he paid $700,000 for this practice, which that was a lot back then. It's even a lot now. And he's a bit freaked out. Younger doctor, super skilled clinically. So he had the chops as a clinician. He just was a bit nervous about, all the debt he was in. So we sat down and worked out, what was his plan? Well, he wanted to make sure that at home, in the business, he wanted a little bit of reserve there. He wanted to, at home, have a decent cash reserve. He wanted to be able to invest a little bit, and he wanted to be out of debt. He really wanted to be out of debt. Some people are comfortable being in debt. Some people aren't, right? He was completely uncomfortable about it. So what we did is we took a look at what it took to run the business, and if he made a certain amount, what the profit margin would be. Because you got to imagine, if we have an overhead of $100,000, and let's say we're collecting $120, $130, if we collect $200, like we produce and collect more, well, our overhead's going to go up a little bit, even if we don't add staff, just with labs and supplies, right? Material costs are going to go up, et cetera. So you have to factor that in. But let's say, so what we did is we sat down and took a look at what his profit margin would be at certain levels. And with that profit that he had, how he would split it based on his life plan. I guess that's basically what I'm telling you, is if you have a plan, this is what I want, you can then take that pile of money and split it up based on your life plan, which is exactly what he did. He had his profit, and then he took a certain amount, then allocated it for taxes, because there's going to be taxes on any money that you take yourself or any money that you use in some cases to retire debt, okay, other than the interest on the debt. In a lot of cases, the debt you're paying off, you may or may not owe taxes on. Again, an accountant question. So we allocated some money for taxes. Then we allocated a certain amount more that he would take home, that he'd bring to his family, and then a certain amount that he would use to retire debt. Okay, and business reserves, etc. It was almost like a little algorithm, or we did it on a spreadsheet. So there was like these 4 or 5 little blocks. So we drop a certain amount of money in there, and it would spit out how much money he was supposed to send to each place each month. Well, 5 years later, he was completely out of debt. And when I say completely, I don't mean that he just owed some money on his house and his cars. I'm talking about his cars were paid off, his house was paid off, his practice was paid off. That was his game, because once he had his plan and he knew that 15 or whatever it was, 30% of everything I make is going to go towards retiring debt, right? He could just hit the pedal to the metal, get the place cranking, and he was debt-free in no time, you see? So you first have to come up with a plan, is you want to get out of debt, you want to invest, etc. I'd recommend doing the exact same thing at home, okay? Because let's say you sit in the office and you go, okay, I've got $30,000 in profit every month. What do I want to do? Okay, I want to allocate, 20% towards paying off debt. So $6,000 is towards debt, a certain amount goes towards taxes, and a certain amount you're taking home. With that extra money you're taking home, you should figure out how you want to split it up. A certain amount's going to go to your pension plan or your retirement. A certain amount's going to go to your family vacation fund. A certain amount's going to go to retiring debt. A certain amount's going to go to cash reserves. You follow? If you have this figured out, and it's really not, there is no, you're going to go online and you're going to see people tell you, okay, allocate it this way, allocate it that way. And somebody may have the answer for you where you go, wow, that was really what I wanted, or your investment advisor might have it for you. Or it might be something that you can kind of just come up with for yourself. The only thing I'd warn you about, run it by your accountant to make sure your taxes are covered, because that's like the debt you never want to find out that you have. It's like, oh, by the way, you owe all this money in taxes, right? But that's my recommendation is, with your profit, if getting rid of debt is important to you, allocate a certain amount of the profit every month to nuking your debt. Okay, obviously start with the high interest debt first. If you have credit card debt or something along those lines, start with that. I've seen people ask me, because in certain cases, you've got an interesting scenario now. Like let's take, for example, someone's practice loan or their home loan is a better example. Their home loan is at 2% on a 30-year fixed mortgage because they refinanced in 2022, right, or 2021 or something like this. And they've got a bunch of cash sitting in their money market earning 5%. I mean, that's a personal choice. You're actually making more money letting your money sit there than the debt's costing you, and you get to write the debt off. So I don't know. Again, these are questions for your financial advisor or accountant, but these are not things that are difficult for you to figure out is the point. But if you're paying off debt, get rid of the high interest debt first, and then kind of prioritize your debt from there. And obviously, if you're making profit, the other thing to think with too is you might be paying some bonuses, so make sure that that's factored in. And I guess the last thing about the profit issue as well is, in a lot of cases, if I were to tell you or tell the average doctor, look, you need to buy 2 more chairs for your practice. You need to equip 2 more rooms, right? So you need chairs, cabinets, maybe a new x-ray that can flip between the 2 rooms. You might need a new scanner, whatever it is you're going to need, right? The first inclination, just because we've been so trained on this, is, I'll go get a loan. Or I'll finance it. Well, if you've got the cash, why? Why would you finance that? Why would I want to pay 6 or 7% interest or whatever the interest rate is on a piece of equipment that I could just write a check for? This is, again, you're getting Jeff's personal opinion here, right? I'm not going to laden myself with debt unless I need it. Debt is a useful tool, but it's a tool. It has specific applications. If I have a ton of money sitting in my account and it's not really allocated for anything, and I have to equip 2 rooms, that's going to cost me, that's cheap these days, by the way, $30,000, let's say, or $40,000, I'm just going to write a check. Why would I, why would I have to go finance it? Why would I take a loan if I have the money? It just doesn't make a ton of sense. But it's just something we've become accustomed to. It's just sort of funny how that works. Anyway, so I think that pretty much hits on that one. That's pretty much all I have for you on these 4 questions. I do hope this helps, right? And please, 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 can't stress enough, make sure that you have a good accountant and a good, if you need a tax attorney, you have a good tax attorney on your team, or not necessarily employed by you, but that you can talk to and refer to, especially the accountant, because I've talked to people and, I hate my accountant. I don't like talking to my accountant. Get a new accountant then. Your accountant should be somebody that you can pick up the phone and call. Maybe they don't pick up the phone right away, but they call you back, and it's somebody that you can ask questions, and they give you answers that are understandable and that you relate with well. And obviously, they should have good skills, and they should be licensed. But beyond that, it should be somebody that you relate with well, just like if I were picking you as a doctor. If I go to a doctor and maybe they've got good clinical skill, but I hate talking to them and I hate being in their practice, it's probably not a good situation. Well, the same thing applies to an accountant. They're another professional. Pick somebody that you actually relate with well, that has good skills, and that you get along with, and you can ask questions. And they can answer a lot of questions for you that you might have. And also, don't forget the overhead sheet download. I have that on the episode webpage. If you want to find out more about MGE, you can find us online at mgeonline.com or call us at 800-640-1140. Folks, that's all I have for you. Have a great week, and I'll see you at the next episode.